What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? One sunset proved my family traditions were never about love or togetherness, but about control, appearances, and money, and for the first time I decided to stop begging for a seat at their table and set one for myself. The lead-up started weeks earlier when my sister Lauren messaged in the family group chat about holiday planning, which always means she has already decided on the menu, the activities, and even the seating chart, and now she just wants everyone to nod along. I asked casually if I should bring something, because even though I know my role in these gatherings has been shrinking for years, I still try to contribute so no one can say I was lazy or ungrateful. She didn't answer at first. A few hours later, when people were joking back and forth about desserts and matching sweaters for the kids, she finally replied, "Traditions are just for real families, but you can always swing by after dinner if you want." It landed like a slap I had already rehearsed in my head, because it wasn't the first time she used that line, but this time it was written, permanent, impossible to pretend I misheard. My parents, who should have spoken up, stayed silent. Mom dropped a quick, "Let's not fight" into the chat, and Dad sent a thumbs-up emoji like that settled anything. It was clear to me in that moment that they were comfortable with Lauren being the gatekeeper, because she gave them the kind of picture-perfect holidays they could brag about to neighbors. I was always treated as the extra adult they had to explain, the one who didn't have a husband or kids, the one who somehow made the table look uneven. I stared at that message, and instead of typing something defensive or sarcastic, I closed the chat and opened a different one, a text thread with Evelyn, my mentor and friend, who months ago had offered me a corporate friends and family rate for a beachfront resort she used for her company's offsites. At the time I thought it was generous, but unnecessary, yet something about the way Lauren dismissed me made my decision immediate. I typed, "Is that offer still standing?" and Evelyn responded within minutes, "Yes, and I can book it for you right now if you want. Just tell me the dates." I packed quietly. No dramatic calls, no pleas for reconsideration. I pulled out a small suitcase and told myself that if they didn't consider me family enough to sit at the table, then I didn't owe them the courtesy of explaining where I would be instead. By the time the holiday weekend started, I was on a plane headed toward an entirely different kind of tradition, one where I chose the company, even if it was just myself. When I arrived, the first thing I did wasn't to unpack or explore, it was to take out my phone, snap a picture of the horizon, and post it with the caption, "Peace, finally." No digs, no hashtags, no context. It was a plain statement that spoke for itself, but I knew exactly what it would signal to the people who had just spent hours preparing their picture-perfect holiday scene without me. I didn't have to wait long. Within half an hour, the group chat lit up. My mother messaged privately, "Where are you?" My father asked if I was safe. Lauren wrote, "Delete that post and call me." I stared at her demand and laughed, because it revealed what mattered most to her, not me being alone, not the cruelty of excluding me, but the optics of me choosing differently and letting the world see it. I didn't delete the post. Instead, I turned off notifications, ordered room service, and sat back with the calm that comes only from knowing you have finally stopped playing their game by their rules. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was something sharper and steadier, the realization that for years they had been telling me I didn't count, and this time I had responded without a single insult, without a single confrontation. Just by making a choice that cost them nothing but showed them everything. What they didn't know yet, but would soon discover, was that this sunset was only the beginning. Because the truth I had just stepped into wasn't about peace or even rebellion. It was about proof. Proof that the traditions they weaponized against me were never about family at all. And once I started pulling at that thread, I wasn't going to stop until I saw where it really led. Can you guess what happened next? When I woke up the next morning and checked my phone, I could already tell from the flood of unread messages that my quiet little sunset had managed to throw gasoline on whatever illusion of control Lauren thought she had over me. She had posted in the group chat late at night, tagging my name in bold letters, writing things like, "Maya clearly chose strangers over family, and she wants attention. Otherwise, why post something like that on a holiday?" I sat there reading every line slowly, not because her words hurt, but because they revealed something much more important: the narrative she was building, the story she wanted the rest of the family to believe, one where I was ungrateful, dramatic, and disloyal, while she remained the one who sacrificed and organized everything. I knew this tactic well, because Lauren had always been skilled at twisting any disagreement into evidence of her martyrdom, and in the past, I had either gone silent or tried to defend myself until everyone begged me to stop. But this time I had no interest in defending. This time, I wanted documentation. So when she accused me of choosing strangers, I typed one calm sentence back: "Lauren, can you please send me the ledger for the Traditions Fund so I can review what I've already contributed?" The silence that followed was almost louder than the outburst before it. Nobody replied. My mother dropped a nervous, "Let's not complicate this," and my father quickly sent, "We'll talk later." But I didn't delete the question. I left it sitting there, plain, impossible to ignore, because if Lauren wanted to paint me as the selfish outsider, then she would also have to explain why she controlled a fund that supposedly existed for the benefit of everyone but was never once transparent. Later that afternoon, while lounging on a chair with my laptop, I opened the screenshots I had quietly collected over the years. Every time Lauren sent us a Venmo request labeled "Tradition Supplies" or "Holiday Prep," I had noticed the small line of text beneath that sometimes gave away the merchant's name. One was a luxury spa not even located in our town. Another was a boutique clothing store where she liked to buy expensive shoes. These had stuck in my head as odd, but I never brought them up because every time I questioned her before, she managed to twist it into me being bitter or jealous. Now, though, those screenshots were no longer just odd details. They were evidence. I typed another message, careful and polite: "I am happy to cover dessert this year if you'll just share the report from the fund so I can settle my part fairly." The wording was intentional. It sounded generous, cooperative, even conciliatory. But beneath that surface, it was bait, because to accept my offer she would have to acknowledge that a ledger existed, and to reject it she would have to show her hand as the gatekeeper who never intended to share anything. Hours went by before she finally responded, and her reply was short but telling: "You have no standing. The fund is for families who host." That single line did more for me than any argument could have, because it confirmed what I had suspected all along, that she had redrawn the definition of family to mean only herself, her husband, and her children, while I was treated as an outsider whose money was welcome, but whose presence was optional. I decided not to argue back. Instead, I opened an old box of my grandmother's things that I had brought with me almost by accident. I had stuffed it into my suitcase at the last minute, thinking maybe I would feel closer to her if I looked through her notes while sitting alone on the beach. Inside the box were recipe cards, handwritten letters, and tucked between two envelopes, a faded piece of paper where she had scribbled a line about the Traditions Trust. It wasn't the full document, but it clearly said, "Funds shall be used for gatherings that include all grandchildren." I stared at those words until I felt a strange mix of relief and fury. Relief, because here was proof that my exclusion was against the very spirit of what Grandma had wanted. Fury, because it meant Lauren had not only twisted the rules, but had been doing so while invoking Grandma's name as if she were honoring her wishes. I snapped a photo of that faded line and posted it in the group chat with one calm sentence: "Interesting." Grandma's words said everyone. I didn't add commentary, didn't accuse anyone directly, didn't raise my voice. I let the paper speak for itself. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing again. My mother called, my father texted asking if I really had the original, and Lauren wrote in all caps, "That's not what she meant." But I had already planted the seed. They all knew I wasn't bluffing. That night, I sat on the balcony of my room and scrolled through the chat again, watching the panic unfold in real time. They tried to change the subject, to guilt me about posting family matters out of context, to lecture me about respect, but none of that mattered anymore, because for the first time the weight of proof wasn't on me. It was on them. They had spent years telling me I wasn't a real part of the family, and now, with one old line of Grandma's handwriting, I had flipped the entire argument. And yet, I didn't show everything. I still had the screenshots, the questionable Venmo charges, and the suspicion that the fund had been used for things that had nothing to do with holidays at all. That was my next move, but for now, I let the silence do its work. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to scream or argue, but to hold up a mirror and make people look at what they'd rather ignore. Tomorrow I would take the box of Grandma's things to Evelyn, because if anyone could make sense of the numbers and the rules, it was her. And once we pulled on that thread, I had a feeling the entire fabric of Lauren's control would unravel. The next morning, I carried the box of Grandma's papers to the resort cafe where Evelyn was already waiting with her laptop open, a legal pad lined with neat columns, and that calm expression she wears when she knows a mess is about to sort itself if we just follow the trail with patience and a little nerve. And after we ordered coffee, I told her everything, from the message that traditions are for real families, to the sudden panic after my sunset post, to the old note I had found that plainly said gatherings must include all grandchildren, and she listened without interrupting, only tapping her pen when I mentioned the fund's vague reimbursements and the Venmo labels that looked more like personal treats than anything resembling community or hospitality. We spread Grandma's things between us, moving slowly through recipe cards and clipped coupons and a few holiday photos that, despite everything, still carried warmth because she had a way of making any room feel anchored. And tucked behind a faded Thanksgiving menu, we found what looked like a photocopied summary page, not a full trust instrument, but enough to spell out the intent with surprising clarity. Because in plain language it said that disbursements from Grandma Ruth's small traditions fund would be made only for gatherings to which all grandchildren received a timely invitation, and that the co-trustees would maintain an annual summary of expenditures available upon request to any beneficiary, which Evelyn underlined twice before looking up at me with that restrained smile she gets whenever the facts finally line up with the gut feeling that started the fight. Evelyn explained that while we did not have the complete trust document, the existence of a summary and the clear language about inclusive invitations and annual reports established two immediate obligations that my family had ignored. The first being the duty to invite without exclusion if funds were used, and the second being the duty to account to beneficiaries like me who had an equal stake in the purpose, Grandma said. And she reminded me that enforcement did not have to mean courtroom drama, because very often a crisp, professional request for records, delivered to the people named as trustees, was enough to reset behavior and, if necessary, to pause spending until the books were made right. I opened my laptop, signed into the group email that still used our old family domain, and drafted a message that was firm without being hostile, writing to my parents by their formal names and copying Evelyn and Lauren, and I asked for the ledgers, vendor invoices, and reimbursement records for the past 3 holiday cycles, and I gave a clear deadline of the end of the week, and I wrote that I appreciated their stewardship and looked forward to hosting one inclusive event as Grandma's summary. Aloud, and before I hit send we read it aloud to check for any stray heat, because the point was not to humiliate anyone, it was to put the responsibilities in writing so that no one could claim confusion later. As soon as the email left my outbox, the group chat started twitching again, a string of half-thoughts and guilt-soaked questions that tried to recenter the conversation on tone, and my mother asked why I was bringing outsiders into family business while my father requested a call to talk this out, and Lauren insisted that I was misreading everything and that the fund was a casual arrangement Grandma never formalized, which would have been easier to accept if not for the photocopied summary sitting under my palm like a brick, so I decided I would not engage in the chat at all and instead posted a simple message on my own feed with a photo of a board game and 2 mugs, captioned with "Traditions are who you make them," which was not a jab so much as a statement of how I intended to live from now on, where belonging was not earned by passing someone else's purity test, but granted by showing up and making room for the people who had been told they did not count. Evelyn and I then took a closer look at the screenshots I had saved, and she showed me how to read the Venmo metadata, how a store name occasionally slipped into the memo line or an address auto-filled by the app. And we made a tidy list of any charge that could not reasonably be tied to a shared meal or an inclusive gathering, and while we were careful not to jump to conclusions, it was hard to ignore the pattern that emerged, because the so-called tradition supplies included a nail bar. Across town, a boutique that sold designer shoes Lauren had worn to a school fundraiser, and a floral subscription that delivered weekly arrangements to her house for months after the holiday season ended, which did not look like oversight or a one-time mistake, but like a habit that had grown bold under the cover of no one ever asking to see receipts. Evelyn suggested one more step before we waited for the deadline, a single phone call to a family friend who was an estate attorney and had quietly handled a few of Grandma's matters years ago. Not to escalate or threaten, but to ask for a neutral reading of the summary language and a reminder of what trustees owe to beneficiaries when questions arise, and she offered to sit in as support but insisted I should be the one to speak, since it was my standing and my exclusion at issue, and I agreed. Because even though a part of me still wanted to avoid anything that sounded like a legal move against my own family, the larger part of me understood that clarity protects everyone, including the people who made the mistakes. Before I made the call, I sent one more message to the group, written with the same measured tone as my email, where I said I would be honored to host an inclusive gathering in late winter at a neutral venue I had already placed a small refundable deposit on, that I would submit the invoice to the fund only after the ledgers were shared and corrected as needed, and that I welcomed anyone who wished to help plan, which transformed my request from a confrontation into an invitation, and also boxed Lauren into a choice she would not like, because saying no would expose that her issue was never logistics but control. We spoke to the attorney for a brief consult that afternoon, and in less than 15 minutes, he confirmed what the summary already made obvious. That funds intended for inclusive traditions cannot be used to bankroll exclusive events or personal image work, and that beneficiaries like me have the right to see where the money went and to request corrective steps if the spirit of the gift was violated, and he suggested a straightforward plan in which reimbursements would be paused until records were provided. Any non-qualifying expenses would be repaid by whoever authorized them, and future access would require documentation of inclusive invitations, which was both reasonable and devastating to the version of tradition Lauren had built like a private stage. By the time the call ended, my inbox chimed with a calendar invite from the attorney titled with Grandma's name and the word clarifications, and my parents were on the attendee list, and Lauren was copied but had not responded. And I sat back and watched the pieces slide into alignment with a mix of relief and something close to grief, because none of this would have been necessary if they had simply meant what they said when they spoke of family, yet the feeling that rose above everything else was resolve, because now there would be a record, a schedule, and a path that did not depend on asking for permission from the person who enjoyed reminding me that I was not part of a real family. And as the sun dropped outside my window, I finally turned notifications back on, ready for whatever came next, because the rules had been named out loud, the clock had been started, and the next move was not a guess or a plea, but a deadline I intended to enforce. The attorney's video window opened with the easy formality of someone who has done this 1,000 times, and, after greeting us by name and noting that he had known Grandma well enough to recognize her handwriting on the summary scan I had sent, he began by laying out what he called the two rails of the track we were now on, the first being that the purpose of the Small Traditions Fund was plainly inclusive and could not be bent by convenience or ego without warping the gift itself, and the second being that beneficiaries like me were entitled to an accounting without delay or drama, which meant that feelings could be acknowledged but would not replace records, receipts, and a plan to correct any misuse that the paper trail revealed. My parents sat side by side in their square on the screen and tried to form the same calm expression, yet I could see the strain around my mother's mouth every time Lauren jumped in with her polished confidence. Because my sister has always relied on speed and certainty to win arguments before facts catch up, and she did not deviate now as she delivered a speech about how traditions are fragile ecosystems that collapse if too many hands interfere, how I had chosen to isolate myself and then punish everyone for my loneliness, and how the fund was never more than a casual family kitty she administered out of love when receipts went missing or vendors asked for deposits. Which might have sounded plausible if the attorney had not held up the summary and read aloud the line that required an annual statement to be available upon request, a clause that exists only when a fund is meant to be tracked and shared. Not improvised and forgotten the moment a centerpiece goes home with the host. When the attorney finished, he offered what he called a reset rather than an indictment, a simple sequence in which reimbursements would be temporarily frozen. The ledgers and vendor invoices for the past 3 holiday cycles would be gathered and shared with me and, if I wished, with Evelyn as an independent pair of eyes. Any expenses that could not reasonably be tied to inclusive gatherings would be identified and repaid to the fund by whoever authorized them, and future disbursements would require a short checklist that included proof of invitations to all grandchildren and a basic summary at the end of each event. And although his tone remained gentle, the effect was seismic, because he had just turned Lauren's private stage into a set of rules anyone could follow. I felt the knot in my chest loosen as my mother nodded and said that transparency sounded fair and overdue, while my father, who usually hides behind jokes or quick subject changes, surprised me by asking if I would be willing to host an event as the reset took place so the family could live the new rules instead of only reading them. And I answered that I had already placed a small refundable deposit on a neutral venue near the beach for late winter, that I would submit that invoice once the ledgers were shared and corrected, and that my only condition was that the invitation be open and clear, with no back channels that separated the so-called real families from the rest. Because the point of all this was not to flip the power from one person to another, but to remove the power games altogether. Lauren tried one more tactic, which was to accuse me of publicly humiliating her with my sunset and my board game photo, to which I said that I had posted about my own piece and my own plan without naming anyone, and that the real humiliation came from exclusion defended as tradition. At which point the attorney cut in and reminded us that tone is not the subject of the meeting and that the only question before us was whether the trustees would comply with their obligations, which my parents agreed to do by the end of the week, and in that small pivot I felt the balance shift for the first time in years, because a boundary had been moved from the realm of opinion to the realm of procedure, where Lauren's skill at spinning stories could not erase an address on a receipt or a date on a reimbursement. After the call ended, Evelyn and I reviewed what the next 48 hours would look like, and she advised me to prepare a clean folder labeled with the 3 holiday cycles, to create a simple ledger template that mirrored the headings in the summary, and to draft a submission for my late winter venue that included the deposit invoice, the capacity chart, and a ready-to-send invitation that listed each grandchild by name. And while I worked through those steps, I thought about how different this felt from the years I had begged for scraps of approval, because now I was not seeking kindness from people who measured me by their comfort. I was enforcing the design of someone who had loved all of us enough to write down what fairness should look like even when no one was watching. That evening, my mother called privately and said she wished none of this had been necessary, that she hated conflict and had only ever wanted the holidays to feel easy, and I told her that ease built on exclusion always sends the bill to the person left outside, which is why it looks cheap to the people at the table, and for a moment she went very quiet before admitting that she and my father had never actually seen a full ledger and had simply trusted Lauren when she said everything was handled. And when I heard that, I felt anger flare and then recede, because in that confession was the truth of how families drift into unfairness without anyone naming it. Not through one villain's plot, but through 1,000 small avoidances that let convenience masquerade as love. Near midnight my phone buzzed with a forwarded email that looked like spam at first glance, a thank you to our generous sponsor message from a Parent-Teacher Association gala held in early spring with Lauren's name displayed as the benefactor and a line thanking the Family Traditions Fund for supporting community culture, and when I scrolled to the bottom I saw that the donation receipt had been sent to her personal account with a note that said, "Processed as hospitality budget," a phrase that might have slipped past me a year ago but now landed like a siren, because it confirmed what the Venmo breadcrumbs had been hinting at, that the fund had been used not only for exclusive gatherings, but for image work completely severed from any inclusive family event, which meant the reset would not be a polite paperwork tune-up, but a genuine correction with actual repayment and new guardrails. I forwarded the email to the attorney and to my parents with a short, calm line asking that it be included in the records for review and that the freeze remain in place until everything was accounted for. Then I put my phone face down and stared at the ceiling with the strange mix of sorrow and satisfaction that always accompanies truth finally stepping into the light, because there is grief in seeing how far people will go to protect a story that flatters them. And there is also relief in realizing you were not imagining the knots in your stomach, and, while I did not sleep much, I did not feel helpless, which to me was the point of the whole operation. Since I would rather be awake inside a difficult reality than dreaming inside a lie that keeps me small. By morning, the attorney had replied that he had received the sponsor email, that he would add it to the review, and that the timetable stood as discussed. And a few minutes later my father messaged that he and my mother were pulling the paper files from the hall cabinet and would scan everything by night, which I knew would put Lauren into a fury I had already braced for. And as I poured coffee and watched the inbox refresh, I felt the next move form with the kind of clarity that does not require permission, because the venue was reserved, the rules were named, and the only question left was whether Lauren would admit what she had done or try to burn the table down before anyone else got a seat, a choice I would not help her make. Since some lessons arrive only when the door to the old comfort finally closes and the new calendar, printed in black and white, starts dictating the rhythm no matter who is holding the phone. The final stretch began not with confrontation, but with a quiet email from the attorney summarizing his findings, and although the language was measured and professional, the weight of it was unmistakable. Because he confirmed that the fund had been used in ways that were inconsistent with its purpose, that reimbursements for boutique purchases, spa charges, and gala donations could not reasonably be tied to inclusive gatherings, and that the next step was repayment of a portion of the expenses, alongside the establishment of a new system where every future use of the fund would require documentation and open invitations. My parents, to their credit, accepted this conclusion without protest, perhaps out of embarrassment, perhaps out of fatigue, but whatever the reason. They agreed to the corrective plan and assured me that they wanted the family to move forward with clarity rather than secrecy, which was the first time in years they had openly chosen fairness over comfort. Lauren, however, did not fold so easily. She fired off a string of messages accusing me of weaponizing Grandma's memory, of dragging strangers into what should have been handled privately, and of caring more about proving a point than about family unity. I read her words carefully and recognized the pattern I had come to know too well. When facts threatened her position, she shifted the focus to tone, to appearances, to anything but the receipts in black and white. This time, though, the strategy fell flat because no one could unsee the thank you email from the gala or the Venmo trail that pointed toward personal indulgences. For once, I did not need to defend myself. The paper had done the work, and the silence from my parents in the group chat told me they were not willing to rescue her from the consequences she had invited. Rather than argue, I chose to act. I finalized the reservation for the Beachfront community room, submitted the invoice to the fund as the first officially documented expense under the new rules, and drafted an invitation that listed each grandchild by name, leaving no space for creative interpretation. The wording was simple but deliberate. Everyone has a seat. I attached the invitation to the reimbursement request and copied both my parents and the attorney, ensuring that the process was transparent from the start. It was not about rubbing anyone's face in a victory. It was about showing that the very system Grandma had envisioned could work if someone cared enough to respect the boundaries she had written. When the day of the gathering arrived, I set up the room with help from a few cousins who admitted, quietly, that they had grown uncomfortable with the exclusivity of Lauren's version of tradition, but never wanted to be the first to speak out. We placed folding tables end to end, lined them with simple dishes from a local caterer, and added one small framed photo of Grandma with the printed line from her summary placed beside it. Funds shall be used for gatherings that include all grandchildren. There were no speeches, no accusations, no dramatic reveals. The statement stood on its own, and everyone who walked past it understood exactly why it was there. My parents arrived looking relieved, as if the weight of choosing sides had been lifted from them by the clarity of rules no one could argue with anymore. They greeted people warmly, helped set out drinks, and seemed almost grateful that someone else had taken the role of organizer without asking permission. When Lauren finally entered, late and stiff, she avoided my eyes, but she could not avoid the reality of the room, because the tables were full, the food was served, and every grandchild had been invited and was present. Her control had been broken not by shouting, not by rebellion, but by the simple act of enforcing what had always been written in Grandma's hand. At the close of the meal, I stood only to hand my parents a folder containing a year-ahead calendar with 3 inclusive dates already reserved at the same community venue, each with a small deposit already paid, each with a placeholder invitation ready to be filled. I told them this was my contribution to making sure the funds stayed alive in the way Grandma intended, not as a weapon or a gate, but as a table big enough for everyone. Then I handed Lauren a separate envelope that contained the repayment schedule from the attorney, along with a short note in my handwriting: "We can all host." That was always the point. I did not wait for her reaction, because the point was not to humiliate her. The point was to leave her with no illusion that the system could be bent again without someone noticing. As people drifted out into the evening, I felt the buzz of the family group chat on my phone, and for the first time in years the messages were not directives from Lauren, but genuine questions directed at me. What time should they arrive for the next event? Could they bring friends? Did I need help with setup? I let the phone buzz in my hand without rushing to answer, because the irony was almost too rich to process. The same people who had once accepted that I was optional were now looking to me for structure. Not because I demanded it, but because I had proven I would treat them all with fairness. I stood by the door of the community room and thought about the years I had spent trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant to feel level, and how strange it was that all it took to shift the balance was a willingness to stop pleading and start enforcing what had already been promised. The victory was not in winning an argument or humiliating my sister. The victory was in showing that power rooted in secrecy crumbles when exposed to daylight, while fairness, once named and honored, has a way of multiplying until it becomes the only option left. As I locked up the room and carried the framed photo of Grandma back to my car, I felt no need for triumph or revenge, only a quiet certainty that the game had changed for good. I had not just reclaimed my seat at the table. I had taken away the ability for anyone to decide who deserved one, and in doing so I had kept Grandma's promise alive in a way that even she might not have imagined. My phone vibrated again with the group chat, and this time, instead of dread, I felt something closer to calm authority, because I knew the next move belonged to me, and whatever came after, the rules would never again be written by exclusion.